Hello, I'm Robert, a voluntary fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is to explain to you why it's very safe for Biden to permit Ukraine to fire shells across the border when Russia is fighting back. And it has the right to defend itself under the UN Charter and the Budapest Memorandum. So Ukraine is the defender. It's defending from its 2014 international borders, within those borders, and it has the right to fire at any other country that attacks it over that border. Russia is the invader. It's attacking over that border. It's actually occupied a large area within that border. It's got lots of soldiers within there, and it does not have the right to fire across the border into Ukraine or to send soldiers into Ukraine. Now, so this is absolutely normal. Putin knows this, and he's just bluffing at NATO. So now, to explain what the changes that Biden has made. So Biden is only permitting this for short range, the shells which have a range of up to 30 kilometers. He's not permitting it for the ATACMS or HIMARS. So Biden always permitted Ukraine. So suppose you had Ukrainians there, just a little over, less than 700 kilometers away, and suppose you had a tank there. That's Russian territory. That's a road that crosses over from Russia into Ukraine. That's the border. And then just across the border, you suppose you had a Russian tank there. T-90, it can fire 7 to 8 shells per minute. Suppose you had some Ukrainians there, and they're just sitting there, they're trying to set up defences there. Then this could be firing shells, 7 to 8 shells a minute, all day, all night, at those Ukrainians. Then, and it doesn't need to move around. And until Biden made this change, then Biden said you can drop your shells in this plowed field, as many as you like. You cannot drop any across the border in that wood, even though that's where the Russian tank is firing from, just because it's across the border in Russia. So that was that very bizarre, and that was why Russia was able to make this advance very quickly, because there's no way that Ukraine could set up. You can't be building trenches and digging fortifications and laying minefields when you've got tanks the other side firing 7 or 8 shells a minute at you, and you can't fire back. So this entire region, there was just no way that Ukraine could do anything with them except just retreat, because of this bizarre rule. So Putin has now changed that, and he now permits them to drop shells in that wood. So Russia will have to recalibrate, and it'll have to move a lot of its forces back. It will not, but Biden has been he said only if they're actively shooting at you. So Russia, or if they're preparing to shoot. But if they're just driving around with their tanks over there, then Ukraine is not permitted to fire back. But this is a very bizarre rule. It's still very bizarre. Why shouldn't Ukraine be able to attack and destroy Russian tanks, because they're the other side of the border and they're clearly intended to be moved into Ukraine to attack Ukraine? But Biden doesn't yet allow that. But he does let them to fire back if they are actively firing or about to fire. So if Putin had, say, 100 tanks there and they drove up the border, Ukraine could do nothing, but then if they started firing, then it could fire back. That seems to be the current situation. And this shows how bizarre it was. So this is those two positions, that tank and that position. This shows this. I suppose the tank was positioned there, and across that field is that ploughed field which is in Ukraine, and this is in Russia. And this is seen from the Ukrainian side. Then, before Biden stopped obeying this bizarre rule, then they could be sitting here and they'd get 7 or 8 tanks, shells a minute dropping on this road, and they couldn't fire back. Now they can. It's safe, permitted, and not in any way escalatory. And this is just a somewhat higher resolution. Bing Maps tends to be a little bit higher resolution. And so you can see that's the wood, that's the road, and that's another place that you could be a tank in the wood. It could be even closer. Indeed, you could have a Russian howitzer there and a tank there, and the tank would fire at the howitzer couldn't fire back. until this change. So Stoltenberg, I've got a few things here, but basically self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter, it's legal, legitimate, and NATO allies are helping Ukraine to uphold that right. I'm sort of put this into bullet points. I use essentially his words, but just shorten the sentences a bit and put them into points, so it's to make it a bit easier to read, especially for autistic people, but for many people find it easier like that. That's essentially what he said. And some rephrasing of the words to make them shorter. And this is actually a direct quote from him. Now, I should change that to 10 days. That's just a mistake. I said 20 days. So after 10 days of fighting, so the media has made a big fuss about it, and you could easily be, you could be expected to think that Russia's been charging across Ukraine, taking large areas of Ukraine, it's on the point of a big victory and about to take Kharkiv. This is what actually happened in the last 10 days. So if you look at the second thing, that is 1 kilometre, that's 10 kilometres. So if you look very, very closely, look at where the V is, a very, very slight advance there, right? There's a somewhat more obvious advance there, the red is Russia. And then here, if you look at the blue there, then Ukraine's taken a little bit back there. That's what's happened in 10 days of intense fighting across the border, with the Russian military attacking with all its might and trying to take bits of Ukraine. And meanwhile, there have been equally ineffective fighting in Chasiv Yar in Donbass region. And the Ukrainians now, they haven't got all their shells yet, but they've got enough shells now to be able to hold back Russia. So there's no way Ukraine's getting stronger and stronger as the shells eventually get to the front line. So there's no way that Russia's going to advance any further anyway. And then with this new rule, then Ukraine may well start retaking some of those regions, because they can't be very well held by Russia yet. And this is where the map I did was for this little place, Optivka. It was somewhere around there, those two places that I showed in the previous graphic. So, that's that. Now this is just, I want to briefly mention, this was a very misleading thing that New York Times, and a lot of people have been influenced by it. And they believe that Ukraine, they've seen all these photographs of Russia and dropping bombs on civilians in Ukraine, and they believe that this is an example of Ukraine doing the same back to Russia. It is not. Now, first of all, Ukraine's never sent anything this heavy, so destructive as this, attacking in the other direction, attacking Russia. They send much smaller bombs on drones that fly about the speed of a Spitfire. And I don't think even the Storm Shadow could do that. I think we'd struggle to do anything like that. I'm not an expert on this, but the open source intelligence, they look at this, say this level of destruction, and also because it came from the direction of Russia, it's clearly a glide bomb that was dropped by accident by a Russian bomber on Belgorod Oblast. And this might seem strange, but it wasn't to me, because Russia has been accidentally dropping bombs off its bombers ever since 2022. I don't know why. I haven't seen analysis of why it is that Russia does that. Whether it's something to do with maintenance of the planes, or whether it's mistakes by the pilots. But they've been doing this all the way through, accidentally dropping bombs. So this was obviously just an accident by a Russian bomber who was on its way to drop this glide bomb on Ukraine. Instead of dropping on a Ukrainian apartment, it dropped it on a Russian apartment in Belgorod by mistake. Not targeted. It wasn't targeting this apartment. It was they just dropped it probably, just by mistake. Pressed the wrong button. No, it fell off. Whatever is the reason. And I'd say that's shoddy. And the reason they got it from Getty Images. It was Getty Images that miscaptioned it. Getty Images used Russian propaganda as the basis for the text it put to label this image. And then the New York Times just bought this image from Getty Images and just copied the caption over and didn't bother to check whether the caption was correct. So it was at two steps. The New York Times just assumed that Getty Images had got it right, Getty Images had got it wrong. So that's what happened there. And they haven't issued any correction, they haven't made any change in the article, they haven't said they got it wrong. It's still there as a claim that this was a Ukrainian attack when it was a Russian mistake. So, and then the Ukrainians never attack civilians deliberately. Certainly, not at the top level. There could be mistakes made by Russians. Sometimes you get individual war crimes by individual Ukrainian soldiers. So that will happen in any war, and then they need to be disciplined, and sometimes they'd be imprisoned or whatever because they have broken. The soldiers are of course permitted to kill Russian soldiers, so they're not going to be held up for murder for doing that. And if they accidentally kill a civilian, but they had no reason, they had some reason to believe they were a soldier, and then that is not murder. But if they deliberately kill a civilian, then that is not permitted under law, and they can be prosecuted for that, even though they're a soldier. And the Ukrainians are very careful. They do prosecute war crimes when they happen. And that's if it's done deliberately. Or they could be prosecuted for manslaughter if they're just not very careful and they kill a civilian. So anyway, the Ukrainians, they always stop at the border. They comply with international law. They're very careful. That is partly the NATO allies wouldn't support them if they weren't doing this. And when they are advancing back, they always stop at the border with Russia, and that is because, unlike previous wars before the UN Charter in previous centuries where they go back and forth across the borders and take little bits of each other country, nowadays, if a country is defending itself, it will stop at its border, because if it goes over, then it's going to become an invader itself. So if it knows that the other side is illegally invading it, it will stop at its border when it's fighting back. And Ukraine always does that. To stay on the right side of law, to be with its allies, and it's committed to that, and there's no way that Ukraine is going to try to take any of the Russian territory. Now, this Admiral Radakin, he said the biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a conflict with NATO because Russia will lose and lose quickly. So he gives various examples, but one example he says is that the Russian Air Force is clearly, NATO is vastly superior to the Russian Air Force. And he talks about how the Russians in February 2022, then everyone expected them to take over the Ukrainian Air Force, airspace from above. First of all, they expected the Russians to destroy the Ukrainian Air Force from above with just an attack with missiles on day one. But Putin he rushed that, and he just destroyed a few of the fighter jets, and most of the fighter jets dispersed. He didn't spend enough time on that phase of the war. He's not a military expert at all, that's very clear. And he doesn't seem to listen to his experts very well. And he had this idea of a cunning plan which he thought would let him take over the Kiev government in a few days and then take over the whole of Ukraine in a week or so. And he was misinformed, and it didn't work, and he had no plan B, and that's essentially why the war happened. So anyway, the Ukrainian pilots, they then immediately dispersed because they got MiG-29s. MiG-29s can land and take off from ordinary highways. They have their air intake above rather than below, so they can easily take off even if there's leaves and twigs and things on the road. They're not going to be affected by that. So the MiG-29s to start with, they just landed and took off from highways, and then they built temporary airfields all over Ukraine, and then by then it was impossible for Putin to do anything about them. But Putin still had an advantage. He had 10 times as many fighter jets as the Ukrainians had. And with that 10-to-1 ratio, NATO countries expected that Putin would very quickly take over the entire Ukrainian airspace. They would be able to, if they had such a ratio against any enemy. So that's what they expected. But it turned out, much to everyone's surprise, that the Ukrainian Air Force has never trained in that kind of operation. And they have only trained in point-to-point dropping a bomb. So their commander says, go and drop a bomb over there. And they fly over there, they drop a bomb, and they fly back again, like in World War II. And they've never, in any of their wars, they've never fought against any opponent with a substantial air force. So they've always just been able to do point-to-point, just say go and drop a bomb there and come back and just do lots of bombing runs. And that's all their pilots know how to do. And so the Ukrainians, who were trained with modern NATO techniques, because they didn't get any military support with weapons, but they get training support after 2014. When Russia took Crimea, the Ukrainians said, well, we need help. And then they got training from NATO, although they did combined exercise with NATO, but they didn't get any technology from NATO apart from the Javelin anti-tank missiles that Trump provided, and then Biden just before the invasion, and the Javelin and the Stinger from Latvia and Lithuania at the very last minute. That's all they got by way of technology, but they did get training. And because of that training, the Ukrainian pilots can basically run circles around the Russians. And you can see that because with maybe 50 or so, a few dozen fighter jets, they held off 10 times as many. And within a week or two, Ukrainian pilots had control of the Ukrainian airspace. And Russia could no longer fly bombing runs over anywhere except the occupied territory. And then they had to use long-range missiles from further away. So the Russian Air Force is vastly inferior to to Ukraine. Ukraine pilots, although they now got a lot of experience fighting in the war, but they weren't obviously as well trained as a NATO pilot is. And then the NATO has vastly superior technology. So we'll come to that superior technology in a minute. So if Putin was to go against NATO, he'd lose very, very quickly. This was one of the most striking examples, but there are many other examples during the war about how untrained the Russian soldiers are with modern techniques, and about how very weak and poor the Russian technology is. I'll come to that a bit more. So now, Putin is not preparing for a war with NATO. This is very, very, very obvious. Just absolutely clear. So we can see that one of the most striking, visually striking examples of this is that he has no modern tanks left in Moscow. Before the war started, he had over 500 modern tanks in Moscow. And they were the elite First Guard tank army, which was Russia's first line of defense against NATO countries if NATO was to start driving over the border into Russia. And these were the most modern tanks that the Russians had. And it was a very elite group of tanks. I say it was, because it barely exists now. And Putin sent them as his best tank unit into Ukraine. And he sent all of them into Ukraine. He didn't leave even one tank in Moscow. And by the September 2022, almost all of them, it was severely degraded. They'd lost lots of the tanks had already been lost or captured or been destroyed or captured by Ukraine. And the UK intelligence, defense intelligence, they said that Russia's conventional force designed to counter NATO is severely weakened, and they said it would take years before they could be back to their capability to defend against NATO that they had in February 2022. And that was already in September 2022, and it's got much, much weaker since then. So Putin is not, if he was planning to attack NATO, he would not have sent all those tanks into Ukraine. he would not have removed nearly all his soldiers along the entire border with NATO and sent them to Ukraine. He would not have taken much of his air defences for St. Petersburg, the second largest city, and for Moscow, and sent them into the Ukraine war, where a lot of them have been destroyed. Those are not the actions of a man who is preparing to attack NATO. And so I hope you can see that. So a lot of this, it just is impossible that could be Putin's planning. He just bluff. That's all he's doing, he's just bluffing. And the reason he is bluffing is because he has learned that it works. If he pretends, and he doesn't even need to do anything, he doesn't need to move a single tank back out of Ukraine, he doesn't need to do any preparations to attack NATO. All he needs to do is say publicly, if Biden sends an F-16 fighter jet to, or if Biden sends Patriot air defences into Ukraine, then Russia will escalate. He says that. And this delayed the Patriot air defences until spring 2023. And similarly, he delayed the modern tanks, he delayed the ATACMS, they only just got there, and it delayed the first ATACMS to the fall of 2023 by the same thing, saying that, you know, if you send ATACMS to Ukraine, I'm going to attack NATO, Russia will escalate. And you can't win a war with nukes. So nukes are only useful for defense. They are not nearly as destructive as people think. Most of NATO conventional forces would survive even if Russia used all its nukes. So no, you can't win a war with nukes. And then even the Soviet Union couldn't. And it had far better capability, far better conventional capabilities than Russia has. So no, but it's very, very clear. So Putin is not. So then people say, but what about Ukraine? Putin said he wasn't going to invade Ukraine, and he did. Well, the Ukraine war was the plan of a ruthless, overconfident, but basically rational man. And he thought he had a cunning plan. And he prepared for it. He did the first series of exercises in 2021, in spring 2021, did them again in spring 2022, which is absolutely the worst time to invade Ukraine. So why he was planning to do it then, goodness only knows. But he obviously, that was his plan, and he was planning to do it in spring, and then he did it. He delayed them a bit because of the Olympic Games in China, and then he did it. And but he thought that he was going to be able to take over Ukraine very quickly, in just a week, as I said, or a week or two, and probably in days, and it didn't work. So that was the plan of a man who was not very good at military strategy, and he had badly advised. He was ruthless, overconfident, but basically rational, just not very good at strategy and not very good at being a general, essentially. But then a plan to attack NATO now, when he knows that all his defences are in Ukraine, all his defences against NATO are in Ukraine, that is a plan by someone who's lost his ability for coherent thought. That is a plan for someone who thinks Ukraine is being attacked by skyscraper-sized spiders. That's not the That's not the plan by a rational man at all. So, can you see the difference between those two? And meanwhile, the constant bluffing is the strategy of a rational man who has seen that his bluffs always lead NATO countries to delay sending significant capabilities, like all these bluffs. Then he has managed to delay Biden from giving Ukraine permission for at least a few weeks. Well, that's something. He's achieved a minor achievement in the war by doing that, but he's achieved with the ATACMS and saying that you can't use the ATACMS against against fighter jets or helicopters and things just over the border in Belgorod. Then he's managed to keep Ukrainians from doing that since 2022, since they first got long-distance attack capabilities with HIMARS. They can't use HIMARS against Belgorod Oblast, and never have. They can't use the M77s against it. And they could have you've done a lot in all that time, which could have made a very big difference to the balance of the war. So Putin achieved all of that just with words, just with bluffs. So he gets constant feedback that his bluffs work and that they help give his side and his soldiers a big advantage in this war over what they would be if he didn't bluff. So he's got very rational reasons to keep bluffing, and he's going to keep on bluffing like this for as long as his bluffs work. So it's because his bluffs work and because people listen to him and because Biden hesitates and doesn't do things if he bluffs. That's the only reason he does it. Poland, the Baltic states like Lithuania, Estonia, they're used to these bluffs. He's been doing these bluffs. He didn't just start bluffing with the Ukrainian war. He's been bluffing for years before then. And that's why Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, and they keep saying to the rest of NATO, he's just bluffing, just forget about him. You can just ignore all these bluffs, they're meaningless. So Poland and Ukraine and the Baltic states have been saying that ever since the war started. And NATO countries like Germany and United States, UK was one of the earlier ones to realise he's just bluffing. And Germany and the United States, then, they're one of the ones who and Italy, they just believe these bluffs still to quite an extent. And they just are very timid. They tiptoe very, very slowly. Say, well, okay, we'll give you them the ability to use the howitzers, and then we'll see what everyone else does. And then as long as he does nothing, we'll maybe say, well, okay, you can use a few ATACMS, so they might do that a few months from now or something. So that's the US approach. But the UK has just immediately removed all its restrictions as soon as just a week ago, and Poland has. And I think so far the 10 countries in NATO that have said that Ukraine can use their missiles without restriction. And so United States will monitor that and see what happens, and then when absolutely nothing happens, which it won't, because there's nothing that Putin even can do, then that's when the United States will likely do that too. Now, this is to explain about how vastly superior. So first of all, to explain about the soldiers. So people often say, okay, Russia has so many people, so it's got more than 3 times as many people as Ukraine. So they say, okay, so Russia clearly can overwhelm Ukraine because it can get so many more soldiers. But Russia doesn't want to. It's not really in a war situation from its side. It's only conscripted less than 1% of its soldiers. Ukraine somewhat more, over 2%. But to put that in perspective, and do I mention that here? No, I don't. I should mention that World War II. That to put that in perspective, for World War II, it was well over 24 point something percent. I think it was 24.7. I can't remember now. It was well over 20%, and if you of the men in the UK were fighting, and about 12% of the population, of the male population, not just the older men. And it was 12%. So it was about 12% of the entire population was fighting in World War II. So the 2% is a sixth of that. So Ukraine, even though a lot of its soldiers are fighting, it's well short of all-out fighting to the extent that it's just getting everyone who could possibly fight to fight, and just the minimal support of its economy to keep it going. It's not doing that. So Ukraine is clearly satisfied that 900,000 soldiers is enough, and it doesn't need many more. And it's slightly reduced its age of conscription to 25. Still, most soldiers, even above that, most men of that age, it's only some of them become soldiers because they keep their economy going, they keep their businesses going. So they haven't, for instance, sent all their university and college teachers to fight on the front line or anything like that. So, or the leads of their business, of industry or whatever, they keep their economy running. And they've got all their people looking after the electricity and people just selling things to tourists and to the general public, and arty people and crafty people and so on. They've got everything just running as normal over most of Ukraine. So that 2% is them not nowhere near World War II levels of mobilization of their population. So the idea that they couldn't find enough fighters is completely wrong. And then this is about how vastly superior the NATO equipment is. So this was an F-35 fighter, and the 400 belonged to NATO, with 100 plus of them in Europe. At the time I did that graphic anyway. 400 in USA and 100 in Europe, that's 500 altogether. These are the modern fourth generation fighter jets. And the F-16s that the US is going, that Ukraine's going to get, it's got some stealth capabilities retrofitted to it. It's 1970s technology, but it can be stealth fitted down, so it's got a radar cross section of about half this area of a door. So that's quite stealthy. But now compare it to the F-35. Its radar cross section is the size of a big potato. So imagine trying to see supersonic potatoes in your military radar. And so the F-35 fighter jet says that effectively they're invisible, that the Russian fighter jets wouldn't be able to see them on their radar systems, and even the ground-based radar wouldn't be able to see them until they're very, very close. So they could just fly over any of the occupied territory, and apart from visually seeing them, the Russians couldn't see them. And they'd just then be able to attack any of their fighter jets from and get really quite close before they're seen, and attack any of the radar on the ground. So in a war with NATO, and Russia has tried to build a fourth generation fighter jet. It's been constructed, but it's not yet fit for combat. It probably never will, because it might take to 2030 or something, because this is very expensive to do. So the reason that Ukraine is, that Russia's technology is so far behind Ukraine is because, so far behind NATO, is first of all, a large part of the Soviet Union economy has become part of NATO, like East Germany. And then, and a large part of GDP is now in NATO instead of in this Russia. And a lot of the scientists and so on. And a large part of the military defense industrial base is now in NATO, when it used to be in Russia. And then in Russia, NATO is not corrupt. It doesn't have oligarchs. Whereas Russia does. And there are examples, for instance, this example of a big defense project, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, and it never seemed to come to anything, and then it folded up. And then they investigated, and they found that the telephone numbers were telephone numbers of public conveniences in one district of Russia, and that all that was that had ever been bought by way of equipment was an old second-hand computer and a model of a missile and some other little bits and pieces that were kept in a locker, and that's all they had for their tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So the oligarchs, in one way or another, have siphoned quite a lot of money by these deceptive methods out of the defense industry in Ukraine, in Russia. So it's a combination of the two, and this is why NATO is so much advanced compared with Russia. Not because they're particularly brilliant scientists. Of course they're good scientists and good military engineers, but so are the Russians, and they got quite a lot of background from the Soviet Union. A smaller country, but still got lots of good scientists. It's just because of the finance. It's very, very expensive to build a fourth generation fighter jet. And the United States is now onto its fifth generation fighter jet. And if the cross-section of a fourth generation is a potato, I don't know what the cross-section of a fifth generation fighter jet will be. Obviously much smaller than that. maybe the cross-section of insect, I don't know. But anyway, so that will be ready by 2030 with some luck for the United States, their fifth generation fighter jet. So there's no way that Russia will attack NATO, and then that's just one example. And there's also the Patriot air defense system, which is vastly better than the Russian S-400, and the S-400 can't stop the 1980s technology of ATACMS. So, just the only reason that if NATO was to give Ukraine some F-35s and some Tomahawk cruise missiles, which have enough range to reach the far side of the Black Sea, so they could sink every ship that Russia has in the Black Sea, which they've got virtually no air defences left to protect them. And they could use those deep into Russia. And so, I mean, if Ukraine had the capability of, had all the equipment that NATO has, and then if NATO was to give them some F-35s, and of course the Ukrainian pilots wouldn't yet know how to fly them, but there are lots of ex-F-35 fighter pilots around who could volunteer to fly them for Ukraine. So technically it's possible. Then Ukraine would have control of the airspace over occupied Ukraine pretty much immediately, and the war wouldn't last very long after that. So how long the war lasts is very much a factor of how much technology NATO is willing to give to Ukraine, and how much they're willing to give to Ukraine is very much a factor of how much Putin can stop them using only his bluffs. So this is why Putin bluffs so much. He knows if he stopped bluffing, the war would be over pretty quickly. So that's why Putin bluffs. He must, from his point of view, he has to stop NATO somehow from sending Tomahawks or F-35s or whatever it is they haven't sent yet. If he doesn't, he knows that if he let them send everything they want into Ukraine, then there's no way that he could continue to fight with the Ukrainian army. So that's long and short why he bluffs, and why military strategists are often very frustrated by all this, and they look at this and say, well, why is NATO so timid, and why won't they send better equipment to Ukraine? But NATO, of course, democracies, and they're very, very careful. And so NATO is the one side that's being very careful here. So they are not taking risks. They're not reckless at all. So those of you who get very scared and think, oh, how NATO is being so reckless by permitting Ukraine to fire back with shells across the border into Russia. The reason that they make a big fuss about it is because they're so cautious, not because it's reckless. So when you get scared, please try and remember that. And the media don't really understand all this, or they hype it up for one reason or another. The only reason it's a question at all is because NATO countries are incredibly, incredibly cautious and timid. And they're just very, very cautious. They must know that Putin is really bluffing, but they're just incredibly timid. And so that's why they do it. They're like a huge mammoth that sees a little midget blowing soap bubbles at them, and they just worry in case the soap bubbles could harm them in some way. And that's essentially what NATO is like. And they just step back and they just wait and watch this midget and let it blow its soap bubbles, and they watch very careful, and they wait and they wait and they wait. And that's essentially what NATO is doing, just in case there's something dangerous about these soap bubbles. So, and hopefully that helps. Now this is why this is the reason why they do this. It's under Article 51, which is nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual collective self-defence if an armed attack occurs, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary for international peace and security. The Security Council, Russia is a permanent member, and it just vetoes any attempt in the Security Council to try and stop this war. So Russia, this is not how the Security Council is supposed to function, but in practice it does, sadly, that if one of the permanent members decides that they want a particular side to be permitted to win a war in an illegal invasion, they will just veto any attempt to take measures in the UN to stop it. So UN is just not able to function in situations like this, although it does function in lots of other situations. But it's completely against the UN Charter what Russia is doing. I mean, another example, in my view, is when the United States invaded and UK invaded Iraq. So it's not always just Russia doing it. The UN, and again, there's no way that the UN Security Council could do anything about that either. So it's Russia breaking the UN Charter here, not Ukraine. And so that's my personal view about Iraq. I was very much against it when... I just want to say as well that none of this, all of this is just meant to help scared people. I am Buddhist, I've taken the vow of not killing, and nothing that I say is intended in any way to influence any politician, any leader, any military strategy, anything like that. So please don't take any of this like that. I'm not taking any sides, I'm just trying to present this very clearly for scared people. This is only meant for scared people. It's not meant to help either side or anyone in this war. Of course I have personal views and so on, but that is not what I'm doing here, and I could never, because of my vow, I never could do that. I could never say anything that would give an advantage to one or other, that could give an advantage to NATO. However much I might want them to win, maybe at some point, but I can't advise them. I never could. So this is the Budapest Memorandum. So the Ukraine gave all its nukes back to Russia in 1994, and in return, Russia, UK, and USA, they all agreed not to attack or threaten Ukraine. And so when Ukraine gave back its nukes, the United Kingdom and the United States, they also wanted them to give them back to Russia. There's no way they wanted them to give them to themselves. So the aim was, because they didn't want them to be, they thought didn't seem very secure for Ukraine to keep hold of them, and they could be stolen or they could be lost or whatever. And Ukraine didn't really want to keep hold of them either. But Ukraine worried that if it gave up its nukes, that it would lose its ability for self-defense. So it said, it asked for security guarantees. So it's not an alliance like NATO. None of them committed to send their soldiers, but they did commit to send military support to Ukraine if it was attacked, in response for Ukraine giving up its nukes to Russia. Well, Russia broke that memorandum when it invaded Ukraine. But this is a memorandum that Russia itself signed, and it's under this memorandum that the United Kingdom and the United States, that's why they're supporting Ukraine, especially vocally. Because the United States committed that it would help Ukraine back in 1994, and so did the United Kingdom. So everyone else is supporting them under the UN Charter, and the United Kingdom and the United States additionally are supporting Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum as a quid pro quo, because Ukraine gave up its nukes to Russia when it split off from the Soviet Union. So that's important, and then it's important to realise that this is nothing to do with NATO. NATO countries do not support Ukraine under NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty can only be used to support other countries in NATO, and Ukraine is not in NATO. So they support Ukraine under UN Charter 51 and under the Budapest Memorandum, nothing to do with NATO. This is not a NATO operation. It just so happens that lots of NATO countries just about all NATO countries and just about all EU countries want to support Ukraine, but it's not a NATO operation. So now, this is about how Russia will never use nukes. So Putin, people have this idea, which I think some of it probably comes from video games and comic books and movies and things like James Bond or whatever. It's not real life. So that's this idea of Putin as a kind of cartoon character who just out of pure evil just wants to use nukes because he's the bad guy. And like when you play computer games, I don't know anything about computer games except what I've noticed from the video clips and so on, that a lot of the computer games, they have essentially insane attackers. They just keep attacking you for no purpose, with taking most absurd risks and for no apparent reason. This is not what we're facing here. This is a real person, Putin. Strange though he may seem to many of us, he is a person. He's not a cartoon character. He's not a movie villain, and he's not a video game villain either. He's a real human being. So he's not going to just madly attack with nukes for no reason. That makes no sense. And he does care about many things. So it's very hard for most people to understand why he would do something like this war, and why he would seem to care so little about things like his soldiers torturing people, attacking people, why he should do things like forceful adoption of children away from Ukrainian parents. These are things that, why would anyone do that? It's very, very hard for most people to understand. Why he murders or is believed to murder the opposition in Ukraine, in Russia and so on. These are very strange things, and they suggest a very ruthless person to most people. And he doesn't seem to care in the usual way about individual Russians. But he's a real person, and he cares about some things. So he cares very deeply about Russia, and Russian culture and buildings and artifacts and Russianness. And he does care about the modern Russia as a culture and as a people, and not so much about individuals. And this was an attitude that the Tsars had back in the time of the Russian Empire. And the peasants have this idea of a patriotic duty to their Tsar, back when they were peasants and Tsars. And some of that survives today, especially amongst the less educated population in Russia. And a lot of the, especially less educated soldiers, are fighting in Ukraine just as their patriotic duty to the Tsar, essentially, which is a cultural thing they have. So that's the kind of dynamic going on here. And so Putin does care about Russia. So this is to help you understand why Putin is not just going to madly attack NATO for no purpose out of pure madness because he just wants to be an evil villain. He's not like that. So he wants to establish a greater Russian Empire, and that is just, that would just obviously be the end of all his dreams, to do that. So Putin, he cares about Russia and Russianness, and so this is to help you understand. And he cares greatly about the imperial Fabergé eggs that used to belong to the former Tsars. So these little things like this look like an egg, and that's a rosebud thing. And he bought, a friend of his bought 9 of these for $100 million and donated them to the Fabergé Museum in St. Petersburg. And apparently an expert on Fabergé eggs that I listened to a podcast or something about by her talking about it, she said that Putin can talk on and on and on about these Fabergé eggs. And he's as soon as she started talking to him about that Fabergé eggs, it's like his eyes lit up, and he just wanted to go out, talk on and on about them. So this is something that he's very keen on. So he does care about things. It's quite strange to most of us, but he's a human being. And he has family in Ukraine, he has a girlfriend, he has children, and so on. And he has a big mansion. His girlfriend was a former gymnast in the Russian Olympics, I think. And he has this big big mansion called, informally called Putin's Palace, and that's where he lives. He doesn't live in a bunker. He doesn't want to live in a bunker or anything like that. So he's a man who likes luxury and who thinks of himself as being a wannabe emperor. So that again can hopefully help you understand that this is not someone who wants to just madly attack NATO out of madness because he's losing. Because that's the only way that you can say this, well, just because he's mad. It doesn't make sense. So no, he's not going to attack NATO. And he's just going to keep bluffing. And then I just want to finish by just talking about a little bit about NATO. A NATO country never has to counterattack. So this is just a big mistake that many people have about NATO. I think, is this the last thing? Yes. So, so first of all, a lot of people think, well, NATO countries they seem to have spent long ages deciding anything. So surely Russia could just attack, say, Lithuania, and then he'd be well established there before they even decided what to do in response. No, that's not true. The reason is because precisely for that reason, NATO has a rapid response force of 40,000 soldiers. And these are committed, and so if any NATO country needs it, then as soon as they call for help and the other NATO countries agree that they need help, then they have access to that response force, which will immediately go there. It's currently 40,000. It's going to increase to 300,000. It's not terribly important to do it right now because Russia is so very weak. But after the war is over, they're going to ramp it up and up until it's 300,000. And so that would mean that if Russia just tries to take a tiny, tiny area, say a little area called Narva in Estonia between Russia and the Baltic Sea, and just basically a little city thing. And if suppose Russia was to just send a few tanks and 100 soldiers or something and try to take that over, then Estonia would say, I'm triggering Article 51, there's no way I can stop Russia, please help. And immediately, within a few days, there'd be 40,000, there'd be first of all 20,000, then a few days later there'd be 40,000, and within hours there'd be those supersonic potatoes flying overhead, and dropping bombs at them and firing down it from above, which they can't even see with their radar. And then there'd be anyone that can get there very quickly would get there very quickly out of the response force. So obviously the fighter jets would get there quickly, and and then the Russians would be running out of Narva like scalded cats. So no, Russia can't just rely on inertia to attack some NATO country, because the rapid response force would respond immediately. And then the other thing that a lot of people don't understand is that the commitment ends as soon as the attack stops. So we've already had a minor incident which didn't trigger Article 4, and that it's up to the country that's being attacked to decide if it needs help. So, for instance, we had a couple of the missiles that Russia, the cruise missiles or Shahed drones, I'm not sure which it was, a couple of them landed in Romania. And so Romania needed better defences to defend its border against these, in case some more stray missiles came into it, whether intentionally testing the lines, because they only went a few hundred metres into Romania. They might have been Putin just testing what he can get away with, or it might have been an accident. What nobody really knows. But Romania then said, well, we need to improve our air defences. Now, if Romania had instead been, say, Estonia, then they might have found it very difficult to get the resources. Then Estonia would say, under Article 50, if it's a small country like Estonia, not going to be a risk, because Estonia is too far away it hasn't got any border with Ukraine. But if it was a NATO country like Estonia, and then a situation like that arose, then Estonia would say, well, look, I need air defences, but I haven't got enough if it doesn't have enough. And then the other NATO countries would quickly rush the Patriot air defences there, or whatever they had, And then once that is in place and the drones can be stopped, then Estonia will say, okay, thanks very much for your help, situation over, and that's the end of it. And that's what Article 5 is. Article 5 is defensive. And it supports the legitimate right of a country to self-defense under the UN Charter. So very much like Ukraine would never push beyond its border. Same under Article 5 of the UN Charter of NATO, then that ends at the border with NATO. So they're not going to counterattack Russia. The aim of Article 5 is just to protect the NATO border. And then once they've done that, and they've achieved that, and Russia's pushed out, that's it. It's finished. So a lot of people don't understand that. And they think that it's commitment to fire nukes at Russia or something. It is not. It's not even remotely like that. And another thing that's quite important to know is that Article 6, which is not as well known as Article 5, the Article 5 only applies for an attack on the territory of the parties in Europe or North America, or on the forces, vessels or aircraft of any of the parties when in or over those territories. You can get this other bit, it's hard to date. So when they're actually in or over, because this is just about way back in the early days when it's very small. So in or over those territories. And so if you have, so this is because of people worrying about trainers in Ukraine. So if France or if Estonia do send trainers into Ukraine, they're very far from the front line. If Russia was to attack them with missiles and the trainers get killed, this has nothing to do with the NATO, even though they're from NATO countries, but it's not NATO territory. So Article 5 doesn't apply, Article 6 doesn't, because under Article 6, Article 5 doesn't apply. So Estonia couldn't say to say the UK, you've got to come and help me because our trainers are being killed by Russia, because this didn't happen in Estonia. So it's nothing to do with the UN, with NATO, if that happens. And if they do send trainers into Ukraine, then they will decide in advance what the rules of engagement are, which will be surely you can't attack back. Leave it to Ukraine. And you just accept the risk that you could be killed as if you were a civilian. So that is surely, if they do send trainers, it will be under those circumstances where they are not to be involved in any way in fighting back. Leave it to the Ukrainians. And if you're killed, you're killed. And then keep them well back from the front lines so that they, the risk of them being killed is very low, and there's actually nothing that they actually even could do individually except use the Patriot, and there are plenty of Ukrainians that can do that. So that is, so this whole trainer thing, is, if it ever does happen, but it doesn't look as if it's going to happen at present, because Germany is very against it. But if it ever does happen, so you can't predict the future, it's not something to worry about at all, because it's just they're just trainers. They're not going to be fighting, and it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's not very different from the generals. So Admiral Radakin, he's been over at least 5 times, maybe more than that, since the war started. The chief of the defence in United Kingdom, and he's always back and forth with Ukraine and talking to Ukrainian generals there. And if he was killed when he was in Ukraine, it's not an attack on NATO. That would just be, he took that risk. He knew he was taking that risk when he visited. And then he was killed, so they have to appoint a new, there'd be probably a big diplomatic thing about it, but there'd be nothing military. So hopefully that helps you understand NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and what the treaty is all about. So that's it. Hopefully some of you are a bit less scared by all this. And then I just want to say, for anyone watching this who's new to all this, this is about where you can find. I'll put a link in the video description to this blog post. I'll put it on Substack first, because it's it just works better. And do join our group if you need help if you're scared. So if one story debunked post to our Facebook group, that's a little bit unclear. I'll make all that a little bit clearer. And also do join our, I should put that in bold. And please look over the groups before posting or commenting, because they help the group to run smoothly. And then do join the group if you're good at helping people who, if you feel you can help people who are scared and panicking, because we often get people who are scared and panicking. And then, I mean, like for instance, while I'm doing this debunk, or if I'm asleep, obviously if someone is right now needing help, then I'm recording this video, so I'll go and look and see if, as soon as this is finished and I'm just about to go off to bed, then I'll check and see if anyone needs help. So there's often people, and there are other people there who, lots of debunkers now, but the debunker, for whatever it is you need help with, may not be able to answer right away. They may be asleep. They may they're working, or they've got other things in their daily life, and so there can sometimes be some hours or more before you get someone to reply. So anyway, so it's very useful if anyone else there can help with first response, and you're saying a few things to help people who are panicking, and then whatever you can by way of other debunks and so on, and lots of people who are very scared, and if you're good at helping scared people to calm down a bit and so on, things like that. So we very much welcome anyone who wants to help the group in any way whatsoever. And then of course fact checkers and debunkers, who people who are reasonably knowledgeable in one way or another, and it can be anything that people get scared about. And so look, maybe some of you there. So anyway, I hope if you come across this in Substack or somewhere else, or on Twitter, and anyway, so I hope this is helpful, and I'll upload this.